Hello, and welcome to Under One Roof's webinar on heating flats, policy updates, and practical steps for tenement flat unit users. My name is Mike Heffron. I'm the Chief Executive of Under One Roof Scotland. Under One Roof is Scotland's only charity dedicated to helping owner-occupiers, landlords, and other building professionals organize common repairs, retrofit, and maintenance around tenement flats in Scotland. And over the course of the past few years that we've existed, we've been gradually moving into this new space of talking about energy efficiency and retrofit work with flats. And we held an event, I think back in August, on this topic with both Gillian and Fabrice, who are joining us today, and had a great amount of response and definite interest in having another one today. So we're back with another round, talking with Gillian and Fabrice. Now, Gillian, just a bit of an introduction. Gillian is the Communications and Public Affairs Lead at the Existing Homes Alliance. Fabrice is the Climate and Energy Policy Manager at WWF Scotland. And what we're going to be doing over the next hour and a half or so is going to be having a few presentations, both from Gillian and Fabrice, and also taking your questions as they come up about the presentations, or more generally about the issues around retrofit and how it interacts with tenement flats and common repairs. Just a few sort of housekeeping things. We'd like to thank our sponsors from Under One Roof, Scottish Government, and the many local authorities that help provide us with funding to continue the work that we do. Under One Roof operates a inquiry service in addition to putting on webinar and in-person events. And we'd encourage you to visit our website, underoneroof.scot, if you have any questions about your particular situation, whether it's retrofit or just organizing common repairs or anything related to that. You can also find out about upcoming events that we're having. We're always are on the go as far as trying to go out to all local authorities around Scotland and doing in-person events, but also hosting webinars such as this as well. So over the course of the next hour and a half, we'll pop in some links about some events that we've got coming up. You can also just go to our website though and quickly sign up to our monthly newsletter, which has a load of information about all the topics we'll be talking about today, but also a list of events that may be coming to your area or webinars that you can join for free. Just a little bit about the process of, what you're looking at here. This is a system called Big Marco. You'll notice up in the corner, you've got something called the chat, Q&A, polls, and handouts. And just to give you a quick explanation before we get started, chat is just basically sort of just comments where we'll be putting in, for you to put in, but also where we'll be putting in links to the various things that we'll be talking about. Q&A is an opportunity for you to pop in a question you have. We've separated that out from the chat just to make it a little bit easier so we can find your questions as we're going. And we'll also be, you'll see when a poll pops up, there'll be a little red dot, and that gives you a chance to respond to various polls, which are kind of interesting to find out what the larger group thinks about the topics that we're talking about. We've got about just over 60 people so far on the webinar too, so I'll be interested to see what the thoughts are of people. If we don't get to your question today, we've had a few came in ahead of time, and we'll have more as we go on. If we don't get a chance to do so, though, we will do our best to get in touch with you and directly answer your question. Probably the best thing to do is just go onto our website and use our inquiry service, or drop us an email at info@underoneroof if we haven't gotten a chance to get to your question today. Right. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gillian. Now, like I said, Gillian is the Communication and Public Affairs Lead at Existing Homes Alliance, which Under One Roof is a member of the Existing Homes Alliance. She's going to be doing a presentation over the next 20 to 25 minutes on the heat and building spill, and taking some questions. After that, Fabrice is going to come on, and he's going to talk about energy efficiency and low carbon heating for flats specifically. So a little bit more specific, where Gillian will be talking more of the bigger policy issues. And then to finish up, Gillian will be doing a shorter piece on the heat network zones that have started to get published by various local authorities. So she'll be touching on Edinburgh and a little bit on Glasgow as an example, but these will be put forward by all the different local authorities in Scotland if they haven't already in the next few months. So, right. So Gillian, welcome. Thanks for coming along today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. My slides should appear in a moment. And in the meantime, thanks very much for inviting us back. Great to be here again. At the last time I presented at the Under One Roof webinar back in August, as you say, Mike, we were talking about what might be in the forthcoming Heat and Buildings Bill consultation. Well, since then, thankfully, the Scottish Government has published proposals for a Heat and Buildings Bill that was published at the end of November. This follows on from the Heat and Buildings strategy that was published in October 2021, which stated that to achieve Scotland's climate change targets, all of Scotland's buildings must be decarbonised by 2045. The Existing Homes Alliance has been arguing for years that this kind of legislation really is one of the foundations for reaching net zero, as it will set out the pathways to zero emissions homes, enabling homeowners and landlords to understand and plan what they need to do and by when. It's also key to giving supply chains certainty. By providing clarity on implementation dates, businesses can plan on scaling up to respond to growing demand, and it will highlight new business opportunities. Starting off with a little bit of background then, how we heat our homes, workplaces and other buildings is the third largest cause of greenhouse gas emissions in Scotland. And there's no way to meet net zero without changing the heating systems in the vast majority of our buildings. This will mean that the vast majority of homes will need to switch from fossil fuel heating, such as gas and oil boilers, to heating from clean zero direct emission systems, such as heat networks and heat pumps. Alongside switching to clean heating systems, we can reduce emissions by making our homes more energy efficient and reducing how much energy is needed to heat our homes. Poorly insulated homes cost more to heat, and improving a property from EPC-E to C, for example, could save households over £500 a year. So making homes more energy efficient not only reduces carbon emissions, but it also reduces bills, helps tackle fuel poverty, and makes homes more comfortable to live in, often delivering significant health benefits, particularly for older and more vulnerable households. And Scotland's not alone in this journey. Numerous countries are developing plans to improve energy efficiency and switch from fossil fuel heating to heat pumps and heat networks. Across Europe, countries are striving to enhance their own energy security by reducing their reliance on volatile fuel markets, clearly demonstrated following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the Heat and Buildings strategy identified that there are low and zero emissions heating options available for all domestic properties in Scotland, and that in the early years, there would be a focus on what it describes as strategic technologies. These are tried and tested technologies that will be the focus of action over the next decade. The Scottish Government will continue to prioritise energy efficiency. It will encourage the installation of heat pumps and where they're cost effective, and will support the development of low and zero emissions heat networks in suitable areas. So what's being proposed in this consultation? Well, the consultation says that a new bill will be introduced containing powers to create a new heat and building standard. All buildings would be prohibited from using polluting heating from 2045. This would apply to the main heating system only, not for secondary systems that a house may have. Owner-occupied homes would be required to meet a minimum energy efficiency standard by the end of 2033. But where they've already installed clean heating, they do not need to comply with the energy efficiency standard. And private landlords would be required to meet that minimum energy efficiency standard by an earlier date of 2028. Now, private landlords are slightly different from owner-occupiers, and where they have installed clean heating already, they are still required to comply with the energy efficiency standard. That's on the grounds that tenants are generally not able to take action to address energy efficiency of a rented home. In terms of meeting the standard, there are two potential routes being proposed to meet the heat and building standard. The first is by installing a number of energy efficiency measures. Now, the Scottish Government is consulting on what these measures should be, but an example list is contained within the consultation paper, and it includes loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, draft proofing, heating controls, hot water cylinder insulation, and suspended floor insulation. It should be noted that the consultation does say that these should be installed where feasible, so it may be that not all of these measures are appropriate for all building types, and we'll come back to that. The second way of meeting the standard is by meeting a heat demand standard. This would mean demonstrating that the home needs less than a certain amount of heat to maintain a comfortable temperature for space heating. This would be assessed through a reformed EPC assessment. The Scottish Government suggests that an initial standard, heat demand standard, could be 120 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year. But again, this is something that's being consulted on. There is actually a third route to meeting this standard. As I mentioned, if you install as an owner-occupier zero emissions heating, you would not then be required to meet the energy efficiency element of the standard. The consultation proposes that people buying a home would be required to end their use of polluting heating within a fixed period following the purchase of the home. Now, the rationale for linking switching heating system to house purchase is that homeowners will be able to see from the energy performance certificate whether a home meets the standard, and can take that into account when deciding whether to make an offer and deciding what the level of that offer should be. Similarly, potential sellers may consider investing in meeting the heat and building standard prior to marketing their property for sale to make it more attractive to buyers. There's also the argument that at a point of upheaval, fairly significant upheaval, like buying a property, to combine the changing the heating system with that process, it reduces upheaval, reduces disruption, and also provides opportunities for accessing financing tied in with mortgages to fund the upgrade. The proposals would apply to the purchaser rather than the seller of the property, and it's proposed that there would be a grace period to have the work carried out, and it's suggested in the consultation that that could be between 2 and 5 years. The consultation does recognise that certain properties, such as flats, will have limited options, and suggests that certain households may be eligible for extra time or be asked to comply with a modified version of the standard. And again, the consultation is seeking views on these. One of the options for many flats in terms of heating is likely to be connection to a heat network. And the consultation suggests that any building within a heat network zone will not need to comply with a standard following purchase. This makes a lot of sense because it makes things clearer for the homeowner, but also provides some assurance to councils and industry that there's a business case for developing new heat networks. The consultation is clear that there will be no ban on properties being sold, but properties in the private rented sector which don't meet the energy efficiency standard by 2028 will not be allowed to be relet to a new tenant when it becomes vacant. And the consultation also seeks views on giving ministers power to introduce additional triggers in the future. It makes the point that there might be other times when it's sensible to move to a clean heating system, such as the point of your boiler needing to be replaced, but there's no commitment to introduce this at this stage. And there are, although the Alliance would be supportive of this, we need to be mindful of the fact that some people, their boiler breaks down suddenly, they need an urgent replacement. So that needs to be taken into account when introducing that additional trigger. Moving on to heat networks, as I said earlier, any building within a heat network zone won't be required to end their use of polluting heating following the purchase. However, the consultation includes a proposal to provide local authorities and Scottish ministers with powers to require buildings that are within a heat network zone to end their use of polluting heating systems by a certain date and with a minimum notice period. In practice, what this would mean is that if there was a heat network available in your area for you to connect to, the council could notify you to tell you that you're required to end your use of fossil fuel heating within a certain time frame. You would then have a choice about how you go about meeting this requirement. So you wouldn't be required to connect to a heat network. You could, for example, decide to install another zero emissions system, such as an individual heat pump or other electric system, or indeed potentially connect to a communal heat pump. Fabrice will explore some of these technologies shortly, and then I'll talk a little bit more about heat network zones and what they might mean for you later on. So there are significant gaps in the current proposals, and it does actually feel like things aren't moving on terribly quickly in relation to flats. There is a recognition within the consultation that for certain property types, such as flats and traditional buildings, it will be more difficult to meet the standard. Many of the measures suggested in that list I showed earlier won't be applicable. And the focus of that list is very much on relatively low cost achievable measures. The kinds of measures that may work better for flats are likely to be more expensive. And for many, the heating solution will be connection to a heat network at some point in the future. The paper states that the Scottish Government is working with partners, including Historic Environment Scotland, to identify the best solutions for traditional buildings. And the Scottish Government is considering developing an assessment tool which would enable building owners to understand what heating and what energy efficiency measures would be most suitable for traditional buildings. The Scottish Government established a short life working group a couple of years ago to look at how the regulations need to consider people in tenements, and that report was published at the same time as this consultation. The short life working group made a number of recommendations and observations. Firstly, given the likely additional cost and complexity associated with doing work to flats, owners will need funding from government and access to other finance. The group supports a phased approach to regulating tenement buildings, with phase 1 seeing individual flats being required to meet new energy efficiency standards, and then phase 2 requiring all flats to meet both the energy efficiency standard and use a zero direct emissions heating system. This approach would need to be developed alongside the Scottish Law Commission's work on establishing compulsory owners' associations. The group also recommended that a whole building assessment for energy efficiency and zero direct emissions heating should be developed, and that key Scottish Government work streams on 5 yearly building inspections and building reserve funds must be taken forward and properly aligned with the work of the Scottish Law Commission on owners' associations. And perhaps Mike can give us an update on that slightly later. The group recommended that the Tenement Act should be further amended to support energy efficiency and zero direct emissions heat common works. And finally, the group noted that expert advice is required on traditional and protected buildings. Now, the Scottish Government has committed to be guided by the working group's recommendations, so hopefully that comes to fruition. Just to finish off this section, I wanted to make the point that what's being proposed in this consultation in relation to the phasing out of fossil fuel boilers is not particularly unusual. 17 countries across Europe have already implemented or are announcing bans on the installation of boilers that run exclusively on some form of fossil fuel. The Netherlands' plan to switch from gas includes banning replacement standalone boilers from 2026. The technologies are tried and tested. Heat pumps are a long-established heating solution in Nordic countries and across Europe. Over 3 million heat pumps were sold in 2022, an increase of almost 40% compared to the previous year. Some European markets, such as Poland and Czechia, doubled in size last year, and in France, heat pumps outsold fossil fuel boilers in buildings for the first time in 2022. Even in Scotland, there are well over 35,000 MCS registered heat pumps installed, and the number of installations has increased by about 113% since 2020. And heat networks too are an established technology in common across Northern Europe. In Scotland, to date, they have been less common, but there are still around 30,000 homes connected to heat networks in Scotland, and significant new developments in Midlothian, Clydebank and in Granton in North Edinburgh. So I'm going to pause here just now. Happy to take any questions, and then Fabrice will be following on shortly.
Thanks, Gillian. Sorry, a little bit of a issue to get me on there, but I'm back on now. Yeah, that was fantastic as far as explaining where things stand with the consultation. One question I had is, is around the issue about cost caps. So is there anything in there about cost caps?
There is. The consultation talks about cost caps and exemptions. The consultation is looking for views on whether cost caps should be set, and there are a range of options that are suggested, from a flat cap of X pounds that would apply across all homes, to a size-based cap, or a purchase price-based cap. We do have reservations about the use of cost caps. Firstly, there are so many different housing markets across Scotland. We think a flat cap would not be appropriate. It's difficult to know. It would be difficult to know where to set that. We also need to think carefully about cost and value. You know, a property may have a financial worth to the market, but in terms of value to the household living in that's quite a different situation. So we're concerned about too much focus on the actual value of the property. Arguably, if cost is the main barrier for a home being upgraded, we think that should be a trigger for support, rather than meaning that the work doesn't go ahead. And the third issue is that if exemptions are constructed appropriately, for example, exemptions for particular property types until the right technology is available, exemptions for certain more vulnerable households, or longer periods of time to comply for certain households, there shouldn't actually be a need for both exemptions and cost caps.
Okay. We've gotten a number of questions in. I'm just taking a look at it. And one of them, what we'll do is, some of these questions actually be really good to answer as we get a little bit later on. So there's a question here about heat network zones we can talk a little bit about later. We did have one question that came in. You had mentioned this is the 120 kilowatt per year target for space heating. Is that target for space heating demand or for primary energy?
It is for space heating. It doesn't include, for example, cooking. As I understand it, it's just for space heating. We actually we're doing some research into this at the moment to inform our response to this consultation, but we do have concerns that this space heating target is not ambitious enough, and actually it would be pretty easy to meet that target without doing very much. So we're not convinced that it would actually deliver the policy objectives of improving the energy efficiency of homes and reducing demand, therefore reducing pressure on the grid and cost of bills and so on. So yeah, it's for space heating only, and we do have concerns that it's not the right target at the moment.
Okay. Had a couple questions actually. There was one question about, does an electric boiler meet the standard? But actually, there was a more general question: so what are individual tenement flat clean systems? So maybe it's just a little bit of discussion about what are we talking about when we're talking about those systems. And I know Fabrice will go into this in a little bit more detail in a second, but maybe just generally you could speak about that.
Yeah, we're basically talking about non-fossil fuel systems. So we're talking about electric-based systems. So that could be a heat pump, it could be an individual heat pump, it could be a communal heat pump, it could be an electric system, and there are some electric heating systems that are relatively efficient these days. But it's basically a non-fossil fuel system. There's some discussion around the use of biomass and bioenergy. So, some flats, for example, have wood-burning stoves in them. If there's some discussion about whether that would be classed as zero emissions or not. It's clearly not zero emissions, but where that is a secondary heating system, that would not be covered by this. Where the wood-burning stove, for example, heated the whole property, it might be covered by this. There's still a lot of unknowns just now, though.
Well, someone had a question, said that the UK Parliament recently voted to continue supporting fossil fuels. What is this Scotland's power against that? Maybe the question actually is reframed a bit, is, so if we're talking about getting electric heating in, is that in Scotland, is that going to be generally fossil fuel free energy that's being used?
It will be in the longer term. I mean, in the shorter term, I think again this year over 100% of Scotland's generated power was based on renewables, and on a UK level, certainly we're moving in that direction. So the energy that is fueling these electricity-based heat pumps will, in the relatively short term, be clean renewable energy.
Okay.
But there is some dependency on the UK government decisions there as well.
And just looking through to see if there's anything else here as far as touching on your things. Is there anything you could answer on this question, Gillian? Again, it might be something that we pass on to the next one, but somebody had asked that their tenement property existing EPC states that there's no potential to improve the current rating of C. How does that affect requirements to change the configuration of the property's heating arrangements?
I think that raises a couple of issues. One, the EPC assessment system. The EPC process obviously is going to be undergoing a fairly significant review, and EPCs should be providing homeowners with a lot more information about the current state of their property and what the opportunities are. I think it also raises the fact that homeowners and landlords need access to the right kind of advice and support, so that it can maybe unpick that kind of advice and say, well, surely there's something I can do. And if there's a specialist available at, for example, a local advice centre who can support you with to develop a more sort of tailored plan for your own property, then one thing that we're very clear about in the Existing Homes Alliance is this legislation isn't going to work in isolation. It will only be effective if it's accompanied by the right EPC assessment system, but also the right enabling framework of advice and support to help people make the right decisions for their properties.
Okay. And I'm just looking through some of the questions to see what might be appropriate for you versus Fabrice. Measures directly against households. Right. I think a lot of these actually might be touched upon from Fabrice. I mean, Gillian, is there anything you can touch upon? I mean, I know Fabrice can about funding schemes for private owners, about what the Existing Homes Alliance is saying needs to be done to support private owners.
Yeah, sure. I mean, clearly there's a big gap between the amount of money that's available from the Scottish Government, in terms of £1.8 billion has been allocated to support the heat and buildings transition, against the estimated cost of decarbonising our buildings by 2045, which is significantly above that. But no one, the Scottish Government's never shied away from the fact that actually a lot of this is going to be have to be funded by the private sector. The reality is that all of us will be having to invest in our properties to make sure that they are upgraded to reduce the to improve energy efficiency and reduce emissions. But there's a big gap at the moment in terms of that financial support and the mechanisms that make that investment more affordable to homeowners. And the Green Heat Finance Task Force, which was set up by the Scottish Government a couple of years ago, issued its first report in November again, which identifies a sort of range of potential financing mechanisms that could help homeowners to meet the cost. One of these is around property-linked finance, which would mean that there would be the borrowing costs associated with upgrading a property would rest with the property rather than the owner, and the repayment cost would pass to subsequent owners as the property is sold on, making spreading the costs over a much longer period, making it more affordable for the owner who's having to arrange the works in the first place. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Gillian. I think there's a number of questions still there, but I think a lot of that actually might be covered or might be best answered by Fabrice. So thanks very much for that. What we'll do is we'll come back to you a little bit later to talk about heat network zones. And let's move on to Fabrice. Hello, Fabrice.
Hello. Hi, Mike.
Oh, there you are. Great. Well, like I said, you're going to talk a little bit about energy efficiency and low carbon heat for flats, and then we'll have about the same amount of time as Gillian does, and then have an opportunity for people to ask questions afterwards. So why don't you just kick off with that, and I'll come back in a little while, and we can take some more questions.
Great, thanks, Mike, and hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Yep, I'm Fabrice. I'm the Climate and Energy Policy Manager at WWF Scotland. So for those of you who don't know us, we are a global environmental conservation NGO. We're active in nearly 100 countries worldwide, and our mission is to help create a world where people and nature can thrive together. We're known for pandas, so why do we care about home heating? Well, in Scotland, it accounts for nearly 20% of our annual climate change emissions. It's also 50% of all the energy that we use each year. So obviously what we do, how we get that energy in future has really big impacts in terms of the energy we generate, the networks to deliver it, and the kind of wider environmental footprint of all that. So it's a really important topic. And we work in Scotland to make sure that the Scottish Government has the right policies to take us in the right direction. My own background is in energy. I've worked in industry as well as for NGOs, mostly policy, but also a little bit of practical experience designing and installing energy systems in homes. So today I'll talk about a bit more about the practicalities of all this, what energy efficiency is, what the measures are, what systems are suitable, and particularly for flats. And those of you who attended the seminar last year, I'll be expanding in a little bit more detail on some of the kind of principles that I outlined there. This will still be quite a high-level overview of the options. It's informed by research that we've commissioned, as well as lots of discussion that I've had with the sector that delivers all this. But if you are interested to know more about any of the topics that I'll talk about, I do recommend you seek out specialist advisors, and links will appear in the chat which help you find those people. So keep an eye out for those. So let's kick off with energy efficiency and just quickly kind of step you through what we're actually talking about here. Ultimately, it's about making sure that the outside, the fabric of your home is able to retain the heat that you put into it. It's a big issue for us in Scotland because our homes are amongst some of the least well insulated in Europe. So we're starting from a relatively low base. And the diagram on the slide there illustrates the typical heat losses in an uninsulated home. So as you can see, the biggest losses are through the roof and the walls, and we can address that by adding insulation. So loft insulation, wall insulation, so you can inject insulation into the cavity of more modern walls, and you can see that in the photo there. With older homes that have solid walls, so stone cottages, for example, you can fit insulation directly either to the inside or to the outside of the property. Draft proofing is kind of an unsung hero of all this. Maybe 10 to 15% of your heat loss can be just through the air leaking out through holes, particularly around doors, windows, unblocked chimneys, loft hatches, that kind of thing. Double glazing, we're probably all familiar with the kind of the warmth and comfort benefits of that. And then finally, underfloor insulation can be quite important as well. Most homes in Scotland have suspended floors on the ground floor. So there's a void beneath the floorboards, and you can fit insulation beneath the floorboards to keep the warmth in there. And you can see an installer there clambering around beneath the floor to fix that in place. So those are the basic energy efficiency measures that we tend to talk about. I think it's important to consider these alongside the kind of condition of the building as well. So, for example, is the roof, are the gutters operating correctly to protect any insulated walls from rain and moisture? And particularly with older homes, it's important to reduce those heat losses through the drafts, but you need to retain some element of ventilation. Victorian-built homes rely on air circulation to keep moisture away from kind of key parts of the building, like timber joists. So it's wise to get specialist advice where you're really maximising your energy efficiency. Question I'm often asked is, what's the right amount of energy efficiency for my home? Unfortunately, there isn't a simple answer to that. It all depends on your priorities and your situation. So the chart on the screen there illustrates the energy efficiency of the UK housing stock So the numbers on the bottom are a way of measuring energy efficiency. That's the space heating demand per metre square per year. Same currency that the Scottish Government standard is given to us in, that Gillian just talked about there. So the lower the number, the more efficient the home. The grey blocks represent the existing housing stock, and then the orange blocks are kind of where we might get them to after improving energy efficiency. So what ambition might we have? Well, point one, the big red arrow, is kind of absolutely minimizing our energy use in the home. So it's technically possible to drive down your energy use to the point where you barely need any heating. Tends to be called a passive house standard. It's quite difficult to achieve, however, in retrofit buildings. Much easier to integrate all that when you're building from scratch. But it is possible. Unfortunately, the cost of that is very high. Point two is where you might get to if you're asking yourself, what's the kind of cost-effective amount of energy efficiency? And what I mean by that is perhaps energy efficiency measures that will pay for themselves within, say, 15 years. So lowering your energy bills and paying back the upfront investment. And that range there on point number two is where we got to at WWF with some research that we commissioned last year. I talked about that in the last seminar, and that's kind of our recommended level that's cost effective for most homes given the kinds of energy prices that we have now. And then finally, point three on the chart, moving up, so 120, that's the Scottish Government proposal. So that's where they're proposing the minimum standard would be for homeowners and landlords to get to. And as Gillian said, you can see quite a number of homes already meet that standard, and it's fairly close to where homes are right now. So in theory, probably quite a lot of homes can reach it with relatively little intervention. Now, finally, how much energy efficiency is a requirement for low carbon heating? That's also the kind of question on everyone's lips. I think it's important to say that energy efficiency really helps make your home more suitable for low carbon heating, particularly heat pumps. However, whether your home can have a heat pump depends on both energy efficiency, but also the capacity of the radiators to actually put heat into your home. Those kinds of systems operate with lower radiator temperatures. So your gas boiler might be heating radiators to between 60 to 80 degrees. A heat pump will operate better and more cheaply between 35 and 50 degrees. So whether your home is suitable for that kind of heating depends both on how quickly the heat leaves it via the fabric, but also, and crucially, the ability of the radiators to deliver the right amount of heat through their existing capacity. If they're not big enough, you can actually make them deeper and larger, and therefore make your home more suitable. So energy efficiency really helps, and it also lowers the costs for low carbon heating, but it's not always strictly necessary. So just something to bear in mind, and I'll come back to this later on. So what does the list of measures that the Scottish Government might require us all to fit to our homes mean for flats? Gillian touched on this earlier. I've rearranged these in terms of kind of how applicable they are to flats. So at the top there, you've got draft proofing, heating controls, and hot water tank insulation. Now, they're generally things that you can do in your own home without needing to think about what your neighbours are doing or even consult them, because it's entirely contained within your flat. On the hot water tank insulation, a lot of flats probably don't have a hot water tank. If you have a combi boiler, which produces instantaneous hot water, then you won't actually have that. In the middle, you've got loft insulation and suspended floor insulation. Now, those are only relevant to top floor flats in an apartment block and the ground floor flats. If you're a mid-floor flat, there's probably not much economic sense in insulating the floors between you and your neighbours anymore, because obviously those flats above and below you are already heated, so you'll be losing relatively little heat between them. If you are in the top floor flat or on the ground floor, then you could consider these measures. Particularly for the loft, you'll need to think a little bit about the ownership and responsibility of the loft space itself. I myself am in a tenement, and our deeds say that actually it's our responsibility for the loft void above, so we were able to do our loft insulation without checking with the neighbours. There's nothing up there as well in terms of storage. I've put cavity wall insulation at the bottom. That's a trickier one. A couple of things to think about in a tenement setting. It's a kind of approach that you'd want to do to the whole building. So not just a single flat, you want to insulate all of the walls. There are height limits as well to how far you insulate cavity walls. So anything over 2 stories tends not to be the way to insulate. So less applicable to those of us who are in flats. So moving on to low carbon heat, and obviously, energy efficiency is really important to reduce our energy demands, to make our homes more suitable for low carbon heating systems. But ultimately, we'll have to get rid of those fossil fuel boilers if we're to reduce our emissions to zero. Broadly, there are 2 options: shared systems like heat networks, or individual systems like heat pumps. I'll spend the rest of the presentation kind of explaining what these look like and how to think about them in terms of a flat. One thing to bear in mind with what I'm about to say is that, generally speaking, experience of putting these systems into privately owned flats and tenements is probably less extensive than in houses. It tends to be more tricky, and because we're still in the early stages of kind of moving to low carbon heat, this area is probably one where both the technology and the government policies are still evolving a little bit. So bear that in mind with everything that I will say. This is a kind of snapshot of the best current thinking, but things are probably likely to evolve, and I will flag where that's the case. So we've talked a bit about heat networks already. So lots of evidence suggests that heat pumps are going to be the primary solution for decarbonising homes in the UK, and that does include flats. But the way we connect flats and tenements to these is likely to be different. So rather than install an individual heat pump into our homes, it's probably more likely that we'll connect flats to one or several large heat pumps in the neighbourhood. Now that's called a heat network or communal heating. And the diagram on the screen puts it very simply in terms of what that actually looks like. You have a single large heat source, and that delivers heat to homes via a network of pipes. So today, heat networks like this already exist. They tend to be running on very large gas boilers, and in future we'll need to swap them over to using either waste heat from industry, or probably more likely large heat pumps extracting heat from the ground, whether that's beneath roads, parks, gardens, that kind of thing. So why are these likely to be better for flats? Well, you'll need less equipment inside and out, which of course, if you're thinking about a tenement or an apartment block, space is kind of critical. We've got much less access to the outside than, say, a house does. There are also economies of scale. So the bigger you make your heat pumps, or the larger scale that happens, you can start to access sources of heat that don't really make sense at the individual householder level. So those are 2 big advantages when we're thinking about decarbonising apartments. What kinds of property are most suitable? Well, the homes will need to be relatively dense. So the kind of limiting factor often with these kinds of systems is the distance that you're piping heat between homes. So that tends to favour tenements, apartments, terraced housing. You'd also need access to a low carbon heat source. So as I said earlier, that could be parks, gardens, rivers, even the space under roads could be used. So those are 2 critical factors that determine where heat networks will be suitable, and Gillian will cover kind of the government process to identify those areas. Now, some types of flat might not be so suitable for this kind of system. Our research suggested that those would be likely very small flats, for example, a studio flat in a relatively modern building, simply because the heat demand is quite low, and you might be able to get away with just a storage radiator. Again, I'll come back to that in a moment. So a deeper dive on heat networks. Generally speaking, there are 2 types of these. So one is high temperature, the other is low temperature, and that refers to the heat in the radiators, the heat that's delivered by the system. So the high temperature heat network is kind of what's been traditionally built, and inside the flat, what you end up with is what looks very much like a gas boiler. There's a little photo there on the slide. It's a heat interface unit, and that takes heat from the network and distributes it to your radiators. Those systems sometimes also provide hot water on demand, so you don't need to have a hot water tank. As I say, the most common type of heat network we have today, and in the chat should be appearing a link to Aberdeen Heat and Power, who operate a number of these in Aberdeen, and probably the largest single operator in Scotland. Now, these types of systems are particularly suitable for city centres, places with densely packed buildings, because you're piping quite high temperature heat between buildings. So the further that goes, the higher the losses. You also need access to a quite high temperature heat source. Typically, they use gas boilers. Some are using waste heat from energy from waste plants or incinerators. But in future, they'll have to transition over to low carbon sources like industrially sized heat pumps. Now, a second type of heat network is a low temperature. And as a sort of name says, on description says, it delivers low temperature heat to your buildings. You still have a network of pipes delivering that energy, but it's at a lower temperature. And that is then upgraded inside the flat or the building using a small heat pump. Now, typically with these kinds of systems, you'll still need a hot water tank in your home, but there are options to shrink the size of those down. So in the photo there is a small heat pump coupled with what's called a heat battery, and both of those have been fitted into a small cupboard in the home. So much less space required for the homeowner, and I guess really importantly with these kinds of systems, because they operate at lower temperatures, they can take heat from heat pumps accessing lots of different sources. So that's probably what makes these much more versatile than the higher temperature heat networks. They're already used today, these kinds of systems, primarily in new developments, and Renfrewshire Council are just finishing a new low temperature heat network in a new campus there. So this does exist, but the experience of applying this to existing homes is much less extensive in the UK. Hopefully in the chat will pop up a link to a video which shows a pilot project in Cornwall where they connected this to lots of kind of mid-century semi-detached homes. And we'd love to see a pilot of this approach in Scotland, because we think this is probably a really good solution for a lot of our tenement buildings. The trouble with getting a pilot is finding a block of owners who are willing to be kind of test bed for that. So if you are interested, do get in touch with Under One Roof, because we can put you in touch with those who'd love to get this kind of a project going. So that's a really simplistic take on the types of heat network that we're likely to see in future. In reality, you get a mix of these technologies, and each individual network will be slightly different. But I think these are kind of useful bits to retain as a home owner. Some key messages here are that even with the less disruptive systems, there's still likely to be a change. That could be needing to have hot water storage in your flat, or making the radiators a little bit larger to operate with those lower flow temperatures. So what do you do if you're not in a heat network zone, or your building is deemed unsuitable for that? Well, of course, you could still fit an individual heat solution, and I'm going to quickly talk through those options now. So to start off with the kind of classic heat pump, the air source heat pump, it is completely possible to put those into flats. The challenge tends to be where you put the outside box, the compressor, as well as the kind of indoor bits, particularly the hot water tank. On the slide, you'll see a photo there where the outdoor boxes have been mounted on balconies. That's great if you have those. Generally speaking, flats will all struggle to find this kind of space. Now, there are solutions where all the boxes go outside with a compressor unit, so that saves on space. But we still face the limitation, particularly with tenements, where you might be trying to find space for 7 or 8 of these boxes in a shared garden, and that quickly adds up to quite a lot of extra kind of infrastructure in your space. So if it's not possible to put an individual air source heat pump in a flat, then you have other options available to you. One potential solution is an air-to-air heat pump. So this is essentially an air conditioning unit, but it's used to deliver heating. It's a bit different to your traditional air source heat pump, because rather than using radiators, you have hot air blowers essentially mounted to the walls. So a bit disruptive if you already have a wet central heating system, as we call it, but you do require less equipment inside the home. So it could be a solution for smaller homes and tenements. These are well used for heating in Scandinavia, so tried and tested. However, in Scotland, as far as I'm aware, very little experience of putting them inside flats, particularly mounting the the outdoor box on the wall and then maintaining that at height. So a few kind of question marks around that. And another thing to bear in mind is that these don't currently qualify for the grant schemes, the Scottish Government grant schemes. So we'd like to see that change, and we'd like to see that more use of these types of heat pump. So it's certainly something that you could look into, and there are companies out there that install them already. Moving away from heat pumps, you've probably also heard of storage heaters, infrared panels, and microwave boilers as potential alternatives. Now, these all run on electricity, so provided that electricity is low carbon, then these will be low carbon as well. I think they all need to come with a health warning, which is that although they're cheaper to buy generally than a typical heat pump, they will be more expensive to run. And that's simply because these all have an efficiency of 1 to 1. So for each unit of electricity that you use, you produce 1 unit of heat. Whereas a heat pump, for every unit of electricity consumed, you're hopefully going to generate at least 3 units of heat. So the running costs of these kinds of systems can be a challenge. And so it's really important that you get advice as to what your bills will look like once you fit them. Storage radiators can use cheaper overnight electricity. So that does bring down the cost slightly. However, our research still found that heat pumps would be better overall. Infrared panels work differently in terms of they heat surfaces rather than the air in your home. So the effect is a bit like sitting in the sun on a nice day. You feel warm. The air temperature inside your home is lower, however. So although this means you'll use less energy potentially to heat your home, whether you find that comfortable really depends on your own preferences. So that's another one to really to check. And I guess there's been limited use of this kind of heating in homes over a long period of time. So it's still kind of an emerging option. And then finally, microwave boilers also just coming to the market. Essentially a gas boiler that uses microwaves to heat water and then send it to your radiators. And again, it's 1 for 1 in terms of efficiency. So your energy bills would go up quite significantly if you just swapped your gas boiler, say, for a microwave boiler. So something to think carefully about. So just to recap what all that means in terms of kind of what we've heard about in terms of the government policies. So what can you do to kind of future-proof your options now? Well, energy efficiency obviously pays back and is a really good step to do regardless of what future heating system that you have. Low temperature heating is something else I would recommend people look into, and that's getting an engineer to tell you whether your existing radiators are big enough to operate at lower flow temperatures. And that will be useful if you go down the low temperature heat network route or perhaps want to fit an individual heat pump. It also makes condensing gas boilers operate more efficiently. So it's a good thing to do under almost any scenario. So that's something you can do now, regardless of kind of what the wider policy landscape looks like. If you are in a heat network zone, and Gillian will let you know how to find that out later, I guess the expectation would be that eventually you will be offered connection to a heat network, we hope. If you're outside of those zones, your options are likely to be, well, you could still look into doing a heat network with just your neighbours in your own block. And Community Energy Scotland are providing grants to help interested groups of owners explore that option for themselves. Otherwise, you could go down the individual heating system options, the individual heat pump, and particularly for the smaller, more modern buildings, perhaps those storage radiators will work out best. And then finally, what does this all look like? What's the overall process in Scotland and what's the help available? Well, first of all, get information. So you can look up your EPC online. The score is likely to change in future because of the wider reforms to EPCs, but there's still lots of information there about the energy efficiency measures of your home, and that will start to give you a sense of what needs doing. You can then contact Home Energy Scotland, who are providing both advice and access to grants. Now, there's support for owners and tenants who are in fuel poverty, so if you're in receipt of government benefits, and there's also grant support available to owner-occupiers and landlords. So Home Energy Scotland can guide you through that process. You'll then need to get quotes yourself. Links in the chat will give you some access to some websites that provide databases of installers for different technologies. Of course, once you've got your quotes and you've gone ahead with the work, A final step that's often overlooked is making sure that you use the new technology properly. So that's making sure that there are no unintended consequences from better insulation, as well as making sure that you're using your new boiler, your new heat pump as effectively as possible. Because they operate differently, and particularly at those lower temperatures, it's important to get advice from your installer about how best to use your system, and that way you'll make sure that you get the most from it. Right, I think that's me. So it's a whistle-stop tour. We've covered a lot of information there, but hopefully we can iron out some of the details in the chat. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabrice, for that real, both whistle-stop, but also somewhat detailed review. We've gotten a number of questions in, actually, on this subject. So what I'll do is, one of which actually was a pre-submitted question, and I think you were saying it's something that you've actually had some experience in, as far as sort of insulation in the loft. And this was a question that said, the top floor owner in a tenement of 8 flats, the loft void is a large amount of rubbish, such as rusty TV aerials and waste. Makes it difficult to lay down top up insulation. Asked the roofer if they would do the removal. They said it was the joiner. Asked the joiner, said it was the roofers. So mainly just maybe from your own experience of living in a tenement, actually, you might be able to touch on that.
Yep, unfortunately, that's often the case. So first step, yes, absolutely. To insulate the space between the joists in the loft properly, you have to remove those materials, that waste, so that you can actually put the material down properly. As to who does that work, I think really any handy person could also be tasked to do it. There are installers that will do loft insulation, and they will check the loft themselves as well, and they'll clear any rubbish. So it can be done. I myself, top floor flat in a tenement, and we had a room that wasn't entirely insulated, and I had the same issue: old TV aerial boxes, TV boxes, all sorts of stuff. So I did it the old-fashioned way and just took it out myself. But I certainly had to do that to be able to get in and around, to get the material into where it needed to go. Happily, I also found a milk bottle from the 1960s from the old Glasgow Milk Co-op. So it wasn't a completely wasted afternoon. It's a nice little antique piece.
Excellent. Got another question here. This was a little specific on the kinds of things, but they asked, do you think that twin duct packaged heat pump air conditioners, and they list one, like the Powermatic Vision, are viable solutions for flats as they have no external unit? And that, I think, is talking about air-to-air heat pumps. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds like it. I can't comment on the specific makes and models, but generally speaking, yes, lots of trusted advisors that I see out there are looking at those kinds of air-to-air air conditioning heat pumps as a useful solution. They tend to require less space, so they could be good for flats. I think one thing to bear in mind is they often require ducting, so you'll still need to lay ducting through the walls or the ceiling. So that can be an issue, particularly in older buildings where there's cornice. But generally speaking, I think air-to-air is definitely something to explore. And we would like the government to make those eligible for grant schemes as well, because I think it's an extra solution, provides a bit more flexibility for the variety of buildings that we have out there.
And what I mean, I think you touched on this a bit, but maybe a question did come in, I think, after the section on it, which was, are they considered cheap to run or cheaper to run air-to-air compared to other systems, I suppose?
Yeah, the research we commissioned, some of the homes in that came out as best with an air-to-air system. So they are very efficient, and they can certainly be competitive in terms of running cost against other types of heat pump and against your fossil fuels. So yes, it's definitely a solution that can help.
Some other questions have come in. You might be able to touch upon this. I know Gillian's done some work on this too. Is there any lobbying or anything that you know existing as far as trying to reduce renewable sourced electricity prices and stop them being linked to gas prices. Is this something that WWF's working on? Or?
Yep, absolutely. So both in Scotland and the wider UK level, one of the key asks is of the UK government, whose responsibility this is to reform the electricity market to take that distortion away. So absolutely, we are hoping for a government consultation on options to do that in the next few months. They had promised to do that by the end of this financial year. And there's two bits to this. There's an immediate reform that could be done to make heat pumps a bit cheaper, and some longer term changes to the electricity market. So processes are in place. They're just very slow. But I would expect over the next, say, 5 years for that distortion to be removed. And that obviously removes this artificial distortion, which makes heat pumps more expensive than, in some cases, than gas.
One question about heat networks is that one question was, how difficult will it be to find routes within tenements from the street pipe to the HIU?
That's a great question. There is a study available online commissioned by South Seeds in Glasgow, and I'll try and dig out the link and send it around later. So they explored that. It can be done, but again, that's probably why we need a pilot project of these options, because until we actually do it in a couple of tenements, we won't know for sure. So theoretically, it's possible, but we really need that practical experience now.
Pippa wrote in, how do you physically connect to a heat network if in a separate house at height and distance from the street?
I think you would, again, technically possible. You'd lay it's kind of like a gas main, except it's got water in it. So you just run a pipe to your house across your garden to the edge of your property, and then obviously finally link that up to your radiators. The challenge for the standalone house is that that pipe is just serving a single home. So that's why heat networks tend to be more economic where you've got high density buildings like apartments and flats, because a single pipe connecting to a tenement, say, will be serving 8 or 10 flats rather than a single one. So it is possible. Whether a home would be offered a connection to a heat network zone, we'd only know that for sure once plans are a bit further down the line and you've got a developer or local authority actually making plans for the heat network in that area. So yeah, unfortunately, it's early days yet in terms of being able to tell people in those situations whether or not they would get a connection. Yeah.
One question was, is it feasible to put external wall insulation on the walls of a pre-1919 tenement?
Oof, that is a big question. How to do this service? It is technically possible to externally clad a solid wall stone tenement. However, it has to be done very carefully. So you would want to do the whole building, all the flats at the same time. You would want to make sure that the insulation runs as kind of seamlessly as possible, either inside or out. So that can be quite invasive, and you'd want to make sure that the roof and the gutters are in a good kind of state of repair, because as soon as you insulate these kinds of walls, because they're naturally meant to have a bit of moisture, a bit of air circulation, they become slightly higher risk to any kind of penetration of damp from the roof. So whilst it's technically possible, it's in practice probably quite challenging. And I think one of the biggest questions we have with those older tenements is the extent to which those low temperature heat networks would operate cost effectively without the need to do that external cladding. Something, again, we just don't know until we've done some more on the ground studies.
Yeah, and from our perspective, I mean, when we're going out to talk to people, there's also the question, particularly with pre-1919 buildings, is that there's the issue of the sandstone that you talked about, where it's potentially, if you seal up that incorrectly with insulation, external insulation, you're potentially seeing that stonework crumbling due to the problems with moisture. But there's also an aesthetic issue as well, as far as covering a pre-1919 tenement flat with insulation. External insulation is probably going to not make that. It's sort of it very negatively affects the aesthetic value with. So there's an element of that as well. I mean, as a general rule, I think no one's really probably seriously talking about external insulation for the historic buildings. Certainly nothing that I've ever seen, and that which makes it somewhat difficult to address the question around insulation with the older buildings. I mean, they make up a third of the tenement stock in Scotland. And they're definitely the highest hanging fruit, I think you would probably say, when it comes to trying to address the issues of energy efficiency. But we had another question that's come in actually on just a little bit on the historic building issue. It was here and then it disappeared on me. Around just basically around some of the challenges. Maybe you could just briefly touch upon that with the historic building. So there's obviously issues around the insulation that we talked about, but also the nature of the building, and also the questions around the listed elements of it. Everything in a listed building is going to be more expensive as far as sort of dealing with windows and such. So I don't know if there's anything, I know you talked a little bit about it before, but as far as just maybe just elaborate a bit on the question of those historic or listed buildings and the challenges there.
Yeah, I think as a general rule, the kind of Victorian type buildings, the way that they're built, you do need to be thinking about retaining some ventilation around all the wooden floors, joist, structural elements. So if you were going particularly for very high levels of insulation, maybe internal wall insulation, that kind of thing, then the way you design and install that becomes really important. As you mentioned there, Mike, as well, there's also the kind of heritage constraints. So particularly if you're in a conservation area or listed, then you'll have limitations in terms of what you can fit to walls and change to windows as well. So I think that they're the primary two, kind of think about the ventilation and think about the planning constraints. It can all be done. It can just be a little bit more difficult than, say, with a slightly more modern building.
And on again, and a few of these questions actually tie in quite nicely. So I had a question that asked, can you explain why cavity wall and wall insulation in tenement flats would need to be done for the whole building at once rather than individual, sort of the benefit of an individual one?
Yep, I think the technical people would call it thermal bridging. So where you insulate just a portion of a wall, you will then get cold spots all around it. So that can then accumulate or encourage moisture accumulation. So that's kind of one reason why just insulating one piece of one wall can be a bad idea. I think there are also issues around the insulation that's injected into the cavity traveling around as well. So generally speaking, again, unfortunately, when it comes to larger buildings, apartment blocks, tenements, installation of these measures is generally more complex. As much as I can say, I would thoroughly recommend looking at the Energy Saving Trust links to get more advice on that. And I know the Under One Roof website actually has some really useful kind of diagrams about the types of construction you might find in apartments, because it does vary much more than with homes.
Yeah, no, that is true. Someone asked if they said that they currently don't have a hot water tank. Would a new one plus battery fit in the current boiler cupboard for a low temperature system, in your estimation?
From what I've seen, yes. If you have an airing cupboard with a hot water tank in it, or that could accommodate one, that could accommodate a heat battery, which is much smaller, as well as the heat pump. And that's certainly kind of one of the selling points that the companies installing that kind of a system make. So yes, in theory, yes, but it all depends on kind of the size and the actual specifics of your flat. But generally speaking, that's one of the big advantages as we see it of those systems.
Someone had a question actually. So, I mean, is there anything that you're aware of as far as the work that's being done on, you'd mentioned sort of funding and stuff like that, the sort of as far as sort of what housing associations or council properties are being done to make sure these properties aren't left behind. Now, I know that they've got some, there is work actually going on in that, those areas. Like I know there's a test project out in Wester Hailes in Edinburgh and I think there's some other ones throughout Scotland is going as well. But as far as sort of the connecting up bit of this, and this may be a question for Gillian, feel free to say so, Fabrice, but as far as the work of housing associations and the need and ability for them to actually do some work on this, because some of the council buildings potentially might be easier to insulate and get forward with those repairs than, say, privately owned properties, because the council actually can has the controlling power to go ahead and get those repairs agreed to, where with private owners you could have much more disagreement about payment and cost and so.
In a nutshell, the social rented sector, so council or housing association owned properties, will also be set an energy efficiency target to hit, equivalent to the same for owner occupiers and private rented sector, so that 120 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. It's currently being consulted on. There's an option for maybe would they need to go beyond that by 2040. And in terms of the heating system, I think, again, that's being consulted on, but the proposals are possibly setting social landlords a kind of percentage target of the number of their homes that have to have low carbon heating. So they are broadly being kind of regulated and required at the same speed as both owner occupied and private rented sector. And they have a separate kind of capital funding pot available to them. Mm-hmm. But as you say, Mike, they're often and have actually often gone further faster because they own multiple buildings, multiple properties. So things are easier when you're organising a programme of work across a stock rather than just if you're an individual owner.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. We've still got a number of questions, but I realize that time's coming a little bit short. We still, I want Gillian to have a chance to talk about the sort of some of the stuff that we've actually got a question about. So, thank you for that, Fabrice. Why don't we bring Gillian back in? And there you are, Gillian. Oh, no, there you are. Okay. So yeah, Gillian, if you could talk a little bit about now, we talked about different sort of systems and stuff. Maybe you could talk more specifically about these heat network zones that are being put forward with the encouragement from Scottish Government by local authorities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. It follows on very well from what Fabrice was just talking about there. So as we've heard, most of us will be switching to clean heating over the next few years, and for many of us that will mean connecting to a heat network. So to finish off this session, I'm going to give a quick overview of where we are with our heat network journey. Just first of all, as a reminder, although there's still a lot to do, this isn't new technology. There are numerous heat networks in Scotland already, and these maps show the current heat networks both in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. Glasgow on the left, Edinburgh on the right, obviously. But how are we going to get to the point where we have heat networks as one of our main heating sources? Because although we clearly have a few in place, we're not anywhere near having enough. Well, all Scottish councils are required to produce and publish local heat and energy efficiency strategies. These were meant to be published by the end of 2023. Some got there, some are still working on them. Now, LHEs are long-term plans for an entire local authority to decarbonise heat and improve energy efficiency. They should set out how each segment of the building stock needs to change to meet national and local objectives, including achieving zero greenhouse gas emissions and the removal of poor energy efficiency as a driver of fuel poverty. They should identify strategic heat decarbonisation zones and prioritise areas for delivery. And it should provide a strategic plan which can be used to target government funding, private investment for heat decarbonising and energy efficiency investment. Now, as we heard earlier, the Heat in Buildings Bill is likely to include powers for local authorities or ministers to require buildings within a heat network zone to end their use of polluting heating systems by a certain date, for example, when a heat network is available to connect to. So a key function of the LHEs is to identify these heat network zones. And this first round of LHEs is very much laying the groundwork for this by establishing prospective heat network zones. And it's intended that these will lead to, in the longer term, the issuing of permits for the development of heat networks. I'm going to focus in on Edinburgh's LHEs to illustrate what it is that they do and what they look like. The LHEs documents contain a huge amount of information, setting out a load of context, relevant policies, and baseline data, amongst other things. They then set out strategic zones. Now, these are geographical areas where heat networks or heat pumps are assessed as being the most viable and where there are particular challenges such as poor energy efficiency and deprivation. Edinburgh's LHEs aims to improve energy efficiency and decarbonising the heat supply of buildings and to eliminate energy efficiency as a driver of fuel poverty. It does identify that there will be significant challenges in achieving these aims. For example, having such a high number of flats and mixed tenure buildings makes both improving energy efficiency and decarbonising more challenging due to technical challenges, but also the complexities of organising and managing work. There's also a high reliance on gas heating, and at present no real driver to switch away from gas. It's still there as an option. And as Fabrice mentioned earlier, due to the way the energy markets are operating, it's still unreasonably less expensive than electric heating. The high number of privately rented homes means that a larger than average proportion of homes are not within the control of council or housing associations. This refers back to one of the questions that was asked earlier. If you've got councils or housing associations in control or present in an area, actually as a sort of community anchor, they're in a strong position to be able to lead work, and where there are areas with more privately rented homes, often individual landlords with small portfolios, it can make it more difficult to coordinate and manage work. And finally, the age of much of the housing means it's much more challenging to upgrade. Again, how we've been talking about this, both in terms of properties being solid wall construction type, but also due to the number of listed and conservation issues. I'm going to apologise in advance for the quality of some of the images here. They're really poor quality. I do suggest that if you're interested, I do recommend that you look at the LHE's delivery plans, both for Edinburgh and Glasgow. I've got some images from both here. So through the LHE's development process, councils map insulation, construction type, tenure, fuel poverty, deprivation, suitability for different renewables such as solar, and much more. So to illustrate, this map is a map of homes with uninsulated walls in Edinburgh, with the darker blue areas being those with higher levels of uninsulated walls. They also map heat demand and waste heat and many other things, and use all of this to determine appropriate solutions for different zones. If you do have a look at one of the LHEs, your LHEs for your local area, you will see that there are many, many maps, fascinating to look at, but sometimes quite challenging to interpret. So alongside the mapping, the council has identified three forms of, we're moving on. Right, alongside the mapping, the council's identified three forms of delivery area. First of all, areas in greatest need in terms of fuel poverty and deprivation, and these will be targeted with energy efficiency improvements. Secondly, areas with the largest number of homes, both on the gas grid and off the gas grid, that are deemed to be heat pump ready. These are areas where homes are likely to be well insulated and already have wet heating systems. And finally, prospective heat network zones. These are areas of Edinburgh identified as having the greatest potential for the development of heat networks. So this map brings all of this together, identifying prospective delivery areas and heat network zones. The areas marked in blue and red, which you can maybe just pick out, are those that are considered to be highly suitable for heat pumps. The areas marked purple are priority delivery areas, i.e. those areas with high levels of fuel poverty and deprivation that will be targeted for energy efficiency improvements. And the areas marked sort of peach colour are prospective heat network zones. These prospective zones are intended to form the basis of statutory heat network zones, which will underpin the permitting regime that's being developed by the Scottish Government at the moment. So this is a list of the different delivery areas. So there are 8 energy efficiency delivery areas in Edinburgh, proposed as areas of focus for interventions through the council's improvement programmes. Many of these are areas where there's a high proportion of council housing, often flatted areas, where there'll also be a mix of some private landlords and some owner-occupiers. There are 10 heat pump delivery areas that represent clusters of homes with the greatest potential to migrate to heat pumps, as the homes are generally well suited to heat pumps with limited need for retrofitting. At the moment, that list is fairly small. The council's LHES is currently saying that it doesn't believe that the conditions are right at the moment to support a large-scale rollout across the city due to a number of issues. Firstly, the fact that the attractiveness of gas at the moment is a bit of a disincentive, the lack of any clarity in terms of the lack of regulation, the lack of sort of regulatory driver to move away from gas and move to zero emissions systems. There are already and finally, there are 17 prospective heat network zones identified in Edinburgh's LHEs. These have been assessed as having the greatest potential for the rollout of heat networks. Now, some of these are actually already under development, including Granton, which is being led by the City of Edinburgh Council, very early stages. South East Edinburgh, which is being led by Midlothian Energy Limited, which is a partnership between Midlothian Council and heat network company Vattenfall, and Ingliston, which is being led by Edinburgh Airport. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on Glasgow's LHEs, but I will show just a couple of maps for illustrative purposes. So although a huge amount of analysis has been carried out, Glasgow's LHEs doesn't currently identify, as far as I can see, energy efficiency delivery areas, as this will be done as part of their developing retrofit strategy. It does, however, identify potential heat network zones and potential heat pump delivery areas. So this map shows Category 1 and Category 2 heat pump opportunities. Category 1 is where properties are suitable for heat pump installation. And Category 2 is where minor upgrades would be required to become suitable for heat pump installation. There are 36 delivery areas identified in Glasgow's LHEs. These are marked in pink on this map, and these are areas that are deemed to be suitable for heat pump installation. And this map shows potential heat zones heat network zones in Glasgow, with the green areas being the primary zones and pink the secondary zones. So all of that was just to really illustrate the process that we're on in getting to a position where we know where heat networks are going to be and we can start seeing them being delivered in our streets. But how does this all come together? What does it tell you about what to expect over the next few years? Well, first of all, irrespective of where you live, it's likely that you will need to meet a minimum energy efficiency standard by 2033 if you're an owner-occupier. And if you're a private landlord, you'll need to ensure that your property meets that standard by 2028. We're not sure what the energy efficiency standard is going to look like yet. It may be that there's a case for a different standard for tenements. If you buy a house and that house has a fossil fuel boiler, you'll need to replace it with a clean heating system, such as a heat pump. If the house you buy is in a heat network zone, you'll be exempt initially, probably. But when a heat network does become available to connect to, you may then be required to end your use of polluting heating at that point. You may want to then connect to the heat network, or you may want to consider another zero emissions heating system. In terms of heat networks, these are major infrastructure projects, and there's still some way to go in terms of agreeing how permits will be issued for developing and delivering these. There's also practical issues at a local authority level in terms of managing and overseeing this. And Edinburgh, for example, is in the process of setting up an LHES management office, delivery office, I think it's called. If you want to know whether you are currently in a heat network zone, you can do this by looking at your local heat and energy efficiency strategy for your area. So far, Edinburgh and Glasgow, Fife, and I think Scottish Borders have all published draft LHEs for consultation. So you can have a look there to see whether you're a heat network zone or a heat pump zone or what. In the meantime, though, councils are encouraging people to engage with the process of identifying heat network zones, and Edinburgh's LHES is currently being consulted on, with that closing at the end of March. And I would also like to remind people that the Heat and Buildings Bill proposals are being consulted on by the Scottish Government, and that closes on the 8th of March. And we at the Alliance would be very interested to hear any thoughts on issues such as the compliance dates, the cost cap issue, and also whether you think a separate standard might be needed for tenement buildings. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. I have one question I had for you is that what would be the best way for people to feed back their thoughts on these issues, either to directly or through the Existing Homes Alliance?
Well, shortly after we finish, hopefully I'll be able to send Annie, and Annie will then circulate some of the key questions we're interested in, and I think it'll be in the form of a Google Doc or a feedback form or something. So we'll be asking specific questions of people, and if you're able to send back your responses to us, that would be great. Or if you just send feedback back to yourselves, and then you could pass that on to us, then we're really keen to make sure that our response to the bill proposals are based on conversations with our members, supporters, and other stakeholders.
Oh, that's great, and we will definitely, if we get any feedback in, we'll definitely pass it on to you as well. A few more questions before we wrap up. We're not going to get a chance to get to all of them, so I'm definitely going to encourage, if we don't get a chance to answer yours, please go to our website and submit an inquiry or get in touch with us via info@underoneroof.scot. We will get back to you with every question that's submitted. We're just running a little bit short on time because of all the great presentations that we had today. Just a couple to touch on. One of them sort of goes back to your discussion of the Heat and Buildings Bill. Is there any measures or allowances that will be made available for those households who are going to find it pretty much difficult, if not impossible, to meet some of the requirements that are set out in the bill? These examples I can think of would be listed in historical, some of those pre-1919 buildings that are in conservation areas, but also someone had pointed out rural buildings. So up in parts of Scotland where the electricity supply is broken by storms for days and weeks, as they put there, and they rely on burning wood to get them through until the electricity is restored. So what is there anything in the consultation about sort of exemptions and such?
Yeah, it is seeking views on exemptions. It does give some examples of where it does suggest that there may be cases where, because of the house type, because of the household type, whether it's a vulnerable household, for example, there might be extensions granted to allow people to meet the standard. In terms of listed and historic buildings, the consultation does refer that the Scottish Government is engaging with Historic Environment Scotland to try and identify what the most appropriate solutions are likely to be for traditional buildings. I do suspect there will be some fairly significant exemptions where at present there may not be the technical solutions feasibly available, but they may well become available over the next few years. In terms of rural buildings, what I would say about the loss of power, that side of things, is the Scottish Government is very mindful of this, and the proposal does talk about, is clear that these regulations would apply to the primary heating source only. So, for example, if you had a backup system that was fossil fuel based, that wouldn't necessarily be covered by these regulations. That's what's being suggested by the proposals at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and maybe just to finish off, I mean, what are your thoughts just generally about sort of the ability to be able to get this done, and particularly for tenement flat owners who often face a lot of challenges anyway in trying to organize common repairs? I mean, some of the stuff that is actually, has been pointed out, is not just individual sort of stairs, but actually whole building things. And there's been a lot of experience with whole buildings having sort of multiple stairs having to work together in one building to be able to do this kind of stuff. But as far as that goes, is there, is it all doom and gloom particularly for those in historic or conservation areas, or do you think that this is something that's really potentially workable if the Scottish government gets the right feedback and gets the legislation right?
I think there's a number of answers to that, and I'll be quick. First of all, a lot of this is going to be dependent on timing. As I think I said earlier, the legislation alone is not going to work if it's just a piece of legislation. It needs to be accompanied by an awful lot of other things. First of all, it needs to be accompanied by movement on compulsory owners associations, movement on regular maintenance plans, because the condition of the property in the first place is critical if you're talking about improving energy efficiency on top of that, but also the sort of the means of the building reserve funds and resolving ways of paying for things at a communal level. So all of that needs to be coming alongside this legislation, and certainly in our response to these proposals, we will be talking about how it will not work for tenements unless there is movement on these other things. In addition to that, some of the recommendations that we've made previously at the Alliance, and also that the Short Life Working Group on tenements made around a sort of phased approach for tenements, I think is realistic. We need to be realistic about this. As Fabrice mentioned earlier, there are things that we can all be doing at the moment to improve the energy efficiency of our home. I'm sitting here freezing because my window on the top of my top floor flat is so full of crafty leaky bits. So there are things that we can be doing that are achievable in the meantime, well in advance of having technical solutions around. I'm certainly not going to be moving to solid wall insulation in my property anytime soon. But there are small things we can be doing in the meantime, and the heat solutions in terms of heat networks, yes, it will take time, but it's not new. As I said earlier, they do exist. They exist across the world. They exist in Scotland, but we need to get on with it. The Scottish Government really needs to put its voice and money behind testing out some of these approaches in our tenemental areas.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Gillian, and we'll bring Fabrice back in here too. But I'd like to thank you both for talking us all through the various issues that that we've gone through today on heat networks and on the heat and buildings bill and energy efficiency. There's a lot there. There's a lot of questions we haven't even got a chance to get to, so I apologize for that. But please do send those on. If we can't answer them at Under One Roof, we'll pass them on to Gillian and Fabrice, and I'm sure they'll be able to. But we'll get you an answer back on those questions. And then finally, we really would encourage you to submit feedback as far as both how it went today and feedback you would like to see in general about how all these issues are going to affect you, so they can inform sort of the responses to the heat and buildings bill that the Existing Homes Alliance will be doing. And Annie's put a link in the chat to check out the heat and buildings consultation. And at the end of the webinar, you'll be directed to a feedback survey, and we really would appreciate your feedback. We did one of these about 5-6 months ago, and we tried to adapt it based on the feedback we got from that one to do this one. And so we'll be doing, I'm sure, another one a little bit down the road this year, once the bill potentially has been laid down in Parliament in the autumn, and where there'll be more and different things to talk about. So please do give that feedback. But on that note, on behalf of Under One Roof, and particularly a thank you to Annie, who's been working diligently in the background, and also a thank you to Gillian and Fabrice for joining us today for the webinar. If you take a look at our website, you can see about what events we've got coming up. But if we don't see you before then in a live event, look forward to seeing you at another webinar in the future. Thanks very much, and have a great afternoon.